So I'll have the video up tonight. Let me get caption. And so that way, if you need to watch it again, you can. Okay, so we are going to cover chapter 7 or unit 7. And this unit, we mostly focus on arrays. Um, as some of you might know, right, in C++, arrays, you also have an STL, which is your standard library that you can implement, but we will not do that today. We will write our arrays manually, so that way you know how to do it. And so to start, we'll begin with part A. So an array allows you to have a group of values or a set of data. Um, Unlike the variable, array can contain more than one value, right? Usually two or more. So it allows you to have a collection of elements. And basically, it is a larger container. And inside this container, you will be able to have many elements, as many as you need. And so we will talk about dynamic array and fixed size array. So you will be able to put in multiple values. It can be string, character. So in C++, we know that we have to have a data type. So if you're using values like the example, like integers, you would have to put int in the front. So for C++, it's strongly typed language. So we always want to put the type for the container that we're creating. That allows the compiler to cut the size that it needs in memory. So to create an array, basically you would start with giving it a type and giving it a name. So in this case, I have int for integer, that's the data type, and numbers is the name. So just like what you did with the variable, you would give it a name. And it needs to be unique and it cannot be a keyword. Now, you would use the square bracket the bracket allows you to initialize the number of elements you're going to have in the array. Meaning that I'm going to have a container that have 5 slots, and in each slot, it's going to contain a value, right? So this is going to allow us to create indices or index for the value. And we would use the equal sign to represent is. So we would say this array called numbers have 5 elements. And these elements are, right, and the values that you would initialize there. Now, to really contain the elements, you need to make sure that you put it in the curly brace and then end it with the semicolon. And that's all you need to create an array. Now, if you have 15 elements, you just put in 15 in the bracket and so on, right? So you can have as many elements as you want. But what if I don't want to if I want to infer an array, you don't have to put the size inside the bracket. When you initialize the value inside the curly braces, it will automatically know that you have that many elements, right? And later on, maybe on Thursday, I'll talk a little bit more about dynamic array. So sometimes we don't know the number of elements that we need to put in the container because your data can grow, right? So for example, you might have thousands of users and each user might input a set of data, some less than others, some are more. So we can create an array that is dynamic, that grow and shrink as needed. But with that, we will have to use a library. But in this case, whatever that you initialize in the curly brace, each element is separated by the comma. And so it would know that that's the number of elements that you will need based on what you put inside the curly brace, okay? So you can infer an array by initializing the values for each of the element, and however many values or however many elements that you initialize, it automatically knows that that's the size of your array. You can also initialize part of your array. Let's say that I have an array that contains 5 elements, but right now I only have 2 values, so I can put in the first 2 values. So you can partially initialize your array, and what happens is the rest of the elements is empty, right? It doesn't have any values yet. And we can add in the value later to be able to have a larger or the equivalent of what we had set up over here, which is 5 elements. So you can partially initialize your array, okay? So when you look at it, the first element is going to be your index 0. So in order to access it, you just need to display. So we can do cout numbers, which is our array name, and the index number goes into the square brace, okay? So the bracket is going to have the index information if you access individual element. But when you define an array, the size of that array goes inside the bracket, right? The square bracket. So I put the table so you can see that's visibly a little bit easier to look. So if I need to access the 5th element, that will be index 4, and the value is 50, right? Any question? Okay, now in order to access each element, the easiest way is to implement a for loop. So for loop traditionally have 3 parts as you see here. So if I need to access one element in each loop, I would start with the first index, which is going to be 0. That's the first element. And I'm going to go up to, right, up to 5. So it's going to stop at index 4. And each time I'm going to increase. So I can go index 0, and then the next loop will be index 1, and so on, up until 4. Why? Because we're using a less than 5 symbol here, okay? And then on each loop, we are going to display, right, the value for each of the element. And that's how you would implement a for loop to access each element from the array. So if you have 50 elements, right, we can go up to 50, and then in each one, we'll just display the value for each loop. Okay, so in this example, you are calculating the average temperature. And so basically, if you have like a thermostat, it would do a reading for each day. And then we would record the temperature for each day. And then what we'll do is we will loop through it and be able to calculate the average temperature for the week, okay? All right, so in this example, you have IO stream at the top, include namespace std. Now in this one, we're not using a separate function, that's later on. So everything is in main. You have 7 days, so that's a constant value. So you have constant days, 7 days. And we are going to create an array. You notice that instead of using a 7 inside my bracket, I already define what days, right, is. So it's going to plug in 7 here, right, using a variable that you previously defined. And then since we are going to add up the temperature and then take the average, we're going to initialize the sum at 0. So we're going to prompt the user to enter the temperature for 7 days. And then we are going to implement a for loop. So we are going to display day, right, 1. So it's going to start with an index plus 1 because humans, we don't say day 0, right? We say day 1. So you have to do an index plus 1. And then you're going to record the input. So cin temperature. And then we're going to take the value that they input and put it into the index. which contains the element for each day. Then we're going to do a running sum for the temperature. So it's going to take each one and add it as it loops. Once we have the sum, right, we're going to calculate the average. So we will take the sum divided by days, which we have, and we would display the average. So that's how you're able to calculate the average temperature for the week. Okay, now if you want to display each of the input for the temperature, we have to loop for each one, right? So it's gonna we implement the display, record the temperature, and for the for loop here, it also has to start with an index 0, it's gonna go up to 7, right? And in each loop, after each loop, it's gonna increase. And we're gonna display day 1, the temperature is, and it access the index where the user input the temperature for that day. Okay, so if it's day 1, so it's gonna be index 0, and it's gonna place that there, and it's gonna show the temperature symbol. Okay, so that's how you're able to have a complete program to show your average temperature and also each day temperature. Any question regarding the example? You can copy and paste this to run it if you like. So in this one, we're gonna use a technique that's shown in example 1. That means that we're gonna implement an array, we're gonna implement a for loop, and we are going to access the element. So the program requires that we have an array, and we're gonna ask the user to input each day sales, right, for the store over 5 days. We're gonna store each of the input as an element in the array. Then we're gonna do a sum of the sales for the week. And then we're gonna check which day has the highest and which day has the lowest. And we're gonna display the result. Okay, so let's look. Let me see. Pull this down, move this out. Okay, so similar to what you see in the example, I have include IO stream at the top and using namespace std. Everything is in main. So in the example, we have 7 days, and our store, let's say that it's only open for 5 days. So we're gonna have constant days, and we're gonna calculate the sales for 5 days. That's what the question has posed. So we put in the number of days, and that's going to allow us to create an element, an array that contains 5 elements. Now you can put in 5 as the value inside your array, but a better practice is to use a variable and implement that variable as the size of your array. Because if you need to change the program, you simply just change the value that you initialize for that variable. Let's say that instead of open 5 days, now we open 7 days. So we can just change that right here. So after I initialize my variable days, I would then implement that into my array called sales. And I'm using a double type because it could be a large value for each input. So let's say it could be $1 million, right, for the larger store. So sales is my array name, and we're going to put in the variable days, which we previously initialized at 5. So that means that we're going to create an array with 5 elements. We're going to do a running sum. So we're going to add all our sales up for the week. So we're going to have a total and that it initialized at 0. So as it loops, it's going to add up each day sales and give us the total for the week at the end. I also have 2 additional variables. I want to check to see if which day has the highest sales and which day has the lowest sales. So these variable needs to store the value or the sales for the highest and the lowest. And then I also have the high day at 0. We initialize that. And that is the integer because we want to store the index. We want to know which day, right? Is it day 4, day 2, day 3? Right, so these 2 variable is just gonna allow us to identify the index for the day that has the highest and the lowest, as you see in the comment. So this is for aesthetic. I have a cout showing that my app is to track sales. Then I simply implement a for loop. First, the first part of the for loop, I would start with index 0. So that's the begin, right? So in the for loop, we talked about having 3 parts, the beginning, the end, and how it updates. So in the for loop, we have index 0 to begin, and it's going to go up to days variable, which is 5. And after each loop, it's going to increase. So similar to what you see in the example 1, I would prompt the user to enter the sales for the day. And we want to do a day plus 1 because, as I said, humans, we don't say day 0. We would say day 1. And I want to add the $sign so it looks correct. After that, we would record each of the input for the sales for the day. So we're going to do a CIN, arrow to the right, and we're going to put that into an array, and each input is going to go to each index, right? So that is going to have 5 input, and it would start with 0 when it loops. So the first input is going to go to index 0. The second input is going to go to index 1, and it's going to go up to 4 for the index number, right? I'm sorry, up to 5, but at 4th index, I mean. And then we're going to, as it loops, it's going to take each of the value for each index and it's going to add. So we're doing a running sum, and we place the sum into the total variable. Now, this is something that you don't see in the example, is we want to check for the day that's lowest and highest. So we want to check to see if the first day, is it low or high, right? So we want to initialize the highest and the lowest, which are the variables that we define on line 16. And we would check the first day sales, index 0. You need to give it a point to start. That's why you start that there, right? And then after that, what you will do is you would then implement a for loop to do the check. So as we proceed in the program, we would need to find the highest sales and the lowest sales. So again, I would have a for loop because it needs to access the array. It's going to start at 1 this time. and it's gonna go up to 5, the fourth element or day 5. And it's going to increase after each loop. So why don't I start at 0? Well, because you already checked with index 0 in the previous line. You already have a starting point there. So after that, we would then check the index 1. And then we would implement a condition. If the sales is greater than the highest, right? So we have to compare the sales to the first day. So if I sell $60,000 on the first day, the second day, if it is $50,000, it's not higher, right? So you have to have a start. Otherwise, you would not be able to have a value to check against. You understand? So because we don't have any value of sales initialized in the program, we have to check it against the previous day, which is we have to start with the day 0, right? Or day 1, I mean, index 0. So we would say that the first day, it's going to check against the previous day, right? So I'm sorry, day 2, which is index 1, is going to check against index 0, day 1. And is it higher or lower, right? And then the highest, it's then going to display the value for the highest sales. And then it's going to identify the index where each of the day would be. And we have another condition. We have to check for the lowest. So if my first day is the lowest, right, then it's going to display that. But let's say my fourth day, if I made the least sale, then we need to access it. So again, we're going to check the sales with the index, and it's going to be less than the lowest. Then the lowest is going to be the sale for that day. Okay. So again, this top part right here is the base. That's your baseline. You have to tell it what is your baseline, what is the highest and what is the lowest. It could be the first day, right? And you're going to use that to check for the other day sales. Any question regarding the condition? Okay, and then we want to display which day that has the lowest sale. Now we're going to output everything in the next part. So just remember that in the for loop, you have the open and the closing curly brace. This for loop encompasses the 2 condition statement, the 2 if, okay? And inside each if, you also have curly braces. So don't forget about those because it will throw error if you're missing curly brace. Okay. Then at the end, we want to display our sales summary. First, we're going to display the total amount that we made for the week in sales. Then we're going to display the highest amount that we made and which day. Last, we're going to display the lowest sales, the amount, and which day. So in a way, you can see that this could be like a very small business analytics program where we would look at, it could be a monthly sale, yearly sale, 10-year sales. You just gotta feed it data, and your data can go inside an array. Now, if you're looking at machine learning or AI implementation, then it would also help to make the decision, right? So this can be part of it. And then we would say, based on the lowest and the highest sales and which day, right? We would look at products for that day, like which product sells the most. And then we would be able to have more inventory of that product. And then we also would look at like sales person, like how many salesperson do we have, and the costs for employee and all of those things. So you can build that out to make it more oriented to the business need. And then after return 0, don't forget to close out your main. Pretty simple, straightforward, right? I can also have this automated. If you think about that, right, we can pull the sales from the cash register, have that machine send, or put that into a database and then import that in from the database into my app, and you can do the calculation that way. So you don't have to have the human input because that can also generate error. So if we have an automated process where at the end of the day, the cash register is going to total everything up and it submits that data, right, to our app, which allows it to put into an array and do the calculation. Because you also see like self-checkout cash register, and if you have the human manually input the data, potentially you will have a small margin of error that they might key in the wrong value, right? So in this exercise, you saw that we implemented the for loop, and then we nested the if inside the for loop to check for the highest and the lowest. So that's expanded from the example that you see. Any question? So a lot of the times when you implement like machine learning or AI, usually it would simulate, right? You would use it to really look at like how we can make better decision on the business, such as, if we are determined that maybe the third and the fourth day in the week have the most sales, but it can also simulate like if you have more employees that day, if you have a certain type of products that day. If you open sooner, like if you extend your business hours 1 more hour, or things like that, like how much more money can you make in the business. So intuitive application like that can be sold to organization and business enterprises, right? Like if you're looking at Walmart, Target, Costco even, right? To look at like, oh, how can I make better, smarter decision for my business to be able to drive more profit? Okay, I'll put up the initial part in case you need that. So run your program, test it. You will need to have 5 input, and then you can check to see if it's correct. And if you're successful there, just clip the screenshot and then add it to your document. Any question regarding exercise 1? Most of you are finished with this? No? Okay. And this technique, you can implement it for other uses too. It doesn't have to be sales, right? It could be grades, could be temperature. For cybersecurity student or IT people, it could be like network traffic. You can analyze that from like how much what kind of bandwidth do we need for performance purposes, right? So you can feed it data and be able to analyze it. Okay. Or even build out traffic patterns for attacks. Okay, let's proceed. We're good. Okay, so add the screenshot into your document. The reason why I do screenshots, so that way you can look at it later. You can save your code if you need. Next we're gonna talk about multidimensional array. When I was at Georgia Tech, I was doing some training a few years ago for data science, right? I took advanced statistics class in my doctorate program, but I never really built out analytics type of program until I got there. And usually you would have to start with a matrix. So your data is going to come in multidimensional array because you don't just analyze like one thing. There's many different factors in what you would analyze. So for example, I was at Berkeley and they were saying the elevators that are used at the casino, it's not simply that you press a button, the elevator comes down. They have an algorithm to determine which elevator for which floor and at which time. So that way it's not, and this is implemented in a lot of hotels too. So that way it's maximizing and optimizing the actual elevator. Because if for every person that pressed the button and the elevator had to go up and down, 1, it's going to wear down the mechanism. 2, it uses too much resources. So they have to efficiently use the resources, right? To save money, to make more money, actually. So you see multidimensional array regularly being implemented for data. And we would see it this way, right? First, we need to know that it would have multiple dimensions starting with 2. And think of it like columns and rows that you're using. It's exactly that, okay? It's going to store the data into rows and columns. Rows goes across, columns go up and down, right? As some of you already took CIS-1A. So in databases, we know that the rows represents records, like it could be student, and the columns can be attributes of the individual record, like test scores, okay? So when you define a multidimensional array, again, you would put the data type for C++, like int for integer, double, if you want larger value, string, if you want text, give your array a unique name, and you need to specify how many rows and how many columns that you are creating. Think of it like making a table, okay? It's exactly that. It's building that matrix, how many rows and columns you need. So in this example, I would have 3 rows. The rows is in the first square bracket, and then follow that with the column, right? Horizontal first and then vertical, okay? Can I have more? Sure, right? But typically you would see a lot of the time we implemented data this way. Okay, so an example that you see here is that I would have 2 rows and 3 columns, right? And what it would do is we would initialize the value and put it in the curly brace and separate them with a comma, okay? So the difference between this and the first example is that the first example is 1 dimension, whereas this one, it's multiple dimension. So you would initialize a value, add another set of values, and separate them by the comma. And then enclose everything in the set of curly brace for your array. Okay? And so if you take a look at what is shown here, right? I have 2 rows, if you look at the table, and then 3 columns. Okay? When I teach Python and Java, I usually put it in a table like this so student can visibly see it. Because when I first learned it, it's hard to grasp, right? But if you understand that the row goes first, right? 2 rows, and then 3 columns, the horizontal, and then the vertical. Okay. All right. Now, if you are accessing, for each element, you have to put in the index, right? Like if I want to access 85, this is row index 0 and then column index 0, okay? So the position of your element is going to go inside your bracket, okay? So if I want to print 90, right, the first row, the second column, and the first row is 0, and the second column 1, right? Because we start at 0. So if you want to change the element, then you can go row 1 and column 2, okay? So just like the other array, you're going to implement for loop, but you are going to implement an inner for loop. First, the outer for loop is going to be for the row. The inner for loop is going to be for the column. And that's how the compiler is going to be able to access. Because as human, we would say, okay, row 0, right? Column 1, right? Same thing. So we got to tell it the row for the outer loop and the inner loop is the column. Okay? And then we would then tell it what to do, like display the data. Okay, the example that I had used here is we are gonna store the test score for 3 students. and have 4 test results. So score and we want to be able to implement that into a multidimensional array. It's going to calculate the average for each student, and it's going to display the score and the average. So when you take a look at this, right, I start with 3 students. That's what the case scenario is, and 4 tests. So now it's 2 dimension, right? You got 3 students and 4 tests. So then we are going to put that into an array. So grades is a multidimensional array. It's going to store the 3 students and the test score. And then we have a variable to calculate the average. So to implement the loop to access this particular array, you're going to have an outer for loop. Remember, this is going to be the roll, so the students. You have 3 parts. You're going to start with index 0, and you're going to go up to, right? We got 3 over here, and we're going to increase after each loop. Then we are going to prompt the teacher to enter 4 test scores. And again, we don't count from 0 as human. We say test score 1. So we were going to do an index plus 1. And we're going to do a running sum with that. Okay. Then for the inner loop, we're going to access the test score. So that's going to be your column. And the tricky part is that for your inner loop, because you're using J here, you got to also put the J for the index, right? Index variable next to the I, which is for the outer loop. Okay, so for the inner loop, you need the indices variable next to your array name. And then we're going to add up your grades to sum, and then we find the average. So after we complete the inner loop, we're going to take the sum and divide it by the number of tests, which is 4, to get an average. But it's an average for each student, right? So the I represent each student. And then after that, we would display. So we have a set precision here, and it's going to put the student information. Now we have to access and display, right, with the for loop again. And it's going to access the test score. Then we're going to display the average. So you can see how that's done with the multidimensional array. And then we also want to display the student. Okay, so in a program like this, you would need to implement multiple for loop. The first couple for loops is to do the calculation for the average. The last 2 for loop is to display, right, to access the grade book, show the tests and the average for each of the student. Okay, so you can check that out and put it in your compiler and run it if you like. Okay, so we kind of see how that's done. We're going to do number 2. So Happy Cafe would like to track the weekly sales of coffee, tea, and juice. You have 3 beverages, right? We're going to write the C++ program. We're going to implement multidimensional array. We're going to prompt the user to input each beverage sales for 7 days and calculate the total sales to display in the summary table. Okay, I'm going to show you how to display cleaner instead of a whole sentence, right? This is the sales for tea, etc. Okay. Okay, so to start, we are going to include IO stream. We are going to include IO manip because just like what you saw in the last program, we want to be able to set the value to display in a certain way, because sometimes you have dollars and cents, right? So you want to make sure that it makes sense to the user when you show that. Then we have using namespace std. That's typical for C++, so you don't have to do std for cin and cout. I built everything inside the main. Remember, I have coffee, tea, and what was it? So 3 kind of beverages. So 4 beverages. And I want to calculate for 7 days. So just like the earlier programs, you have the constant value that's initialized for the number of beverages that we're selling and the number of days. We have an array called double sales, just like the second exercise. And the row is going to be our beverages, and the column is going to be the days, like day 1, day 2, day 3. And we are going to do a total for the running sum. So those are the container that we created. The first for loop here, we are going to ask the user to input, similar to what you've seen in the last exercise. So I have a for loop. I'm going to start with an index 0. It's going to go up to 3 for the beverages, and it's going to increase after each loop. I would display to the user, enter the sales for beverage, and we're going to do an index +1 for day 1, right, over 7 days. The inner for loop, this is now going to be the day, the column, right? Remember, the outer loop is the row, the inner loop is the column. So I would have the inner for loop in J is going to start with index 0. It's going to go up to 7 days. And we're going to increase after each loop. And we would display day J +1 because, right, we count day 1, day 2, not day 0. And we're going to input. Now, for your input, it's going to go into your array. And remember, right, you have to have the indices for I and J inside. Okay. Make sure you have the closing brace for the inner for loop and the closing brace for the outer for loop. Any question? Then next, what we're going to do is we're going to build out how we can implement a for loop to display the sales report. So I have sales report. And I'm going to set the width to 10 and show the beverage. Okay. These are spaces. Remember we talked about that? So that way it aligns straight. Okay, like a table. Because in console, you really don't have a way to clean up your text except for line everything up accordingly. So we're going to set width to 10, and it's going to allow us to line up, right, beverage. And then with that, what we're going to do is we're going to implement a for loop. The first for loop here is going to be for the days. And we're going to also set the spacing for day. So that way it looks like a summary table. And we're going to show day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. up until day 7. Then we want to also set the spaces for total, so that way we can display the total. If you do it this way, everything would kind of line up and it looks a little nicer for aesthetic purposes, right? So down the line, if you need to display your data, this is a technique. The next for loop, we're now going to bring in the data from our array. So this for loop right here is just a way that we can line everything up and then show the columns and row. And also in the next for loop, we're going to show the running sum for each. Okay. So we're going to start with index 0. We're going to go up to day 7. We're going to increase after each loop. And as it loops, it's going to add the sales to the total. And here we need to also set the spacing so that way when it plays the data, it lines up with your beverage. Then we have an inner for loop, right? Remember rows and column. So this part is for display, and we're going to display the total. So the inner for loop, again, like I said, that would be for the column. We're going to also set the spacing to display the sales, right? And again, the inner for loop, we want to make sure that we have 2 indices from our array. And it would have the running total. And then closing out the for loop for the inner, and we want to set the total that we're going to bring down from here. So we're going to display that so that way people know how much we made there. Any question? Okay. And then for the last part, we just have the closeout of the outer for loop, and then we're going to do return 0 and close out main. So when you run this and you put in your sales for your beverages, you would see that, if you set your spacing correctly, then you would be able to have everything lined up accordingly, like a table on your console. Any question? So as some of you are still finishing, the takeaway from this, right, as you see, multidimensional array requires that you have nested for loops to access the element, to display the elements, to calculate a sum from all your elements. So you have to implement different type of nested for loops for that purpose, right? We're gonna see the last one, which is the next exercise before we end the session, where we will implement the functions for the specific task for modular design. So you can implement functions. But in this program, we put everything inside the main and we simply implemented different nested for loops to calculate the total, but it needs to access the element. That's why we have to nest, right? So the outers for the row, the inners for the column, and we would be able to access each element for your array. I noticed that when I taught 17A before, a lot of students struggle with multidimensional array because it's hard to grasp like why it's using two indices for the inner loop, right? Because in order to navigate, like for example, when you're looking at the table, in order to navigate to like a specific location of your element, you have to follow, right? Row, column, which one? So the compiler is the same. You have to tell it which position of your element based on that matrix. Okay, think of it matrix or table. So that's why we're using the indices on the inside to navigate to the column area. So when you set your spaces here, you notice that the total is 2 higher, right? That's after all the other data information. So that way you can create a table that lines up accordingly. And you can manipulate the value to fit data as needed, right? To line everything up accordingly. So that gives you alignment. Any question? Are we okay? Run the program and see. So after you input the day's sales, you wanted to look at your summary report and see if it's, and you can make adjustment to how you want to display the data, if, to make it cleaner, just for aesthetic purposes. And then we'll do the last one. We'll talk about functions with array next. Okay, any question? You need any help on this? Okay, we're good. Okay, so that was exercise 2. We did multi-dimension array, right? So can you have more columns and rows? Sure, you can, right? It gives you, so this example, we're just gonna limit it to only 2. But if you have more columns and rows, you just already know, you just keep nesting loops inside. There are libraries, right? STL, like arrays, STL allow you to also implement functions that are pre-made for your array. We're gonna talk about vector on Thursday. For C++, vector is useful too. Okay. For the last part for today, we're gonna talk about how we can implement functions with your array. And function allows you to be reusing the code inside your program and also give you modular design. So that way it's easier to update, modify, or debug. Okay. When you're working with arrays, function can be used to input elements, especially if you have lots and lots of data. Okay. You can also use function to display the value of your elements. Statistically, we see this now quite a bit for analytics. So you can use it to calculate like average, total, other things, right? So you can do analysis with functions. And instead of rewriting your code over and over again, you can just call the function, right? So when you pass an array into a function, you remember how we talked about pass by value using a variable inside the parentheses? We're going to do the same thing. So when it does that, when you put it inside the parentheses, it basically used a memory address. It's called a reference. You know how when we use the ampersand, right? We talked about how pass by reference. So you can pass it, you can implement it into the parameter. The system usually just look at the value that you have in your array in the address, okay, at the address. Okay, so the example here, you have a function called display array. And we are going to put in two variable. You got the ARR here, represents the array, and then the size of it. Then we're going to implement the loop, the for loop, to be able to access each element. And we are going to, so it's going to display the value for each of the element, right? So we just simply do a cout. So your function can be like this. This is a non-returning function, so it's a void. And you can have an array that initialize with this value. And then we can call the function, right? So in the main, you can call the function display array. And then in the parameter, we would specify your array name, right? And the size, which is what you state here. Okay, so in the example we have, we're going to use the function in the array. And it's passed into the function by reference. We would pass the size as what you see in the little snippet. And we want to prevent any kind of errors that are out of bound. And we want to simplify any kind of operation using functions. So in this example, as you can see, right, we have a couple functions. We have function to record the input. And in the parameter here, we would have the array and its size. And that's how you pass the array in a function. So inside the parentheses, you simply put in your array name and the variable that contain the array size. Okay? Same thing with the next one to display. We have a returning function to calculate the total. And we're using the sales array and its size, okay? And then another function to calculate the average, same thing, array and size. So you get the drift, right? So we want to have a variable to set the size, and that's, and then we want to have your array inside the parameter here. And then we want to also determine the highest, so the double type, we know that these are your returning functions. So we prototype them at the top. Inside the main, we would define, right, the days, which is going to be the size of our array, and the sales, which is our array name, and it has 7 elements. So we would then require, so here is your function call, input sales, and then your array and its size, okay? But the main difference between the prototype and the call, remember what we learned? No type in the parameter, okay? You don't put int or double there. So when you do a function call, simply have the function name without its type, and then do the array name and the size without the type, okay? So we would then call that in the main. And then we display. So now we do a function call for the display, and then we have the array and its size, okay? So in main, we call the other functions that we define or prototype. And then on the bottom, we're going to then define the function. So in the first function for the input, we have, when you do a definition, you need to put the type, right, of your array and the size. And then we simply prompt the user to input for the sales. And for each of the input, we're going to loop. And we want to display. You saw this in the other example already. So it's going to record each input, and it's going to put each input as element inside the array that we created, which is sales. And so if they have 10 input, then that's going to update the size. But in this case, we have it for 7 days. So it will be 7 input. Now, On the next one, same array, same size. We're going to loop again. So as we record the input, we're going to use a for loop to output the input that the user had entered. Okay. So it's going to loop through, read each of the input value that was stored in the array and display it. Okay. Then we do the same thing for calculating the total. So here's the running sum. The main difference in this one, it is a returning function and you have double initialized at 0. So that way you can double total, right? And the total is gonna then represent the sum of our sales. We're gonna return from that because we're gonna use that value to calculate the average. So you can chunk your program into separate function and then be able to implement that. On the last one, you saw this in a prior exercise. We're going to determine which day is the highest day for sales. Okay. So with that, we have to implement an if condition and return the highest. So how do I know how to create a function that would be returning or not, right? If you're using the value with other function or using that value for calculation, do a returning function. But if for input and output, just use a void, a non-returning function. That should be good enough, right? And for the array, you need to implement for loop, multidimensional array, nested for loop. Okay, simple. Okay. So now let's do the last exercise and we'll call it a day. We can refer to example 3. We're going to make a program. We're going to implement functions and we're going to use this for grade input for 5 students. We want to determine, so first we're going to prompt the user to input the grades, like maybe the teacher. So this is going to be a separate function for grade input, just like what you saw in the example. Another function to display grades, right? Another function to display the highest and the lowest grade. And the fourth function to display the average grade. Okay. So we can use these two as non-returning function and these two as returning functions, right? That's, All right. After that, we just screenshot and answer. Don't forget to answer the last question, what you've learned about arrays. So let's look. Okay. So I have include IOStream using namespace that's std at the top. I prototype the functions. So I have void input grade, just like how you saw that in the example. I have my array name called grades. And it's type double. Remember, when you prototype and define, the type needs to go in the parameter and in your function if it's returning. Okay. So I have another function that I prototype. This is going to display grades. And my array is called grades and its size for the parameter. Then the next 3 function, I'm going to fulfill the task that's required. First, find the highest. Same array and its size. Next function, find the lowest. Same array and the size. And then I need to fulfill the average calculation requirement. So I have a function called calculate average. Same array and its size. So you prototype that above the main. We are going to implement some variables and call the function that we prototype and then define them after main, right? We talked about that last week. So inside my main, I have a variable called students, and I know from the problem that it tells me that there are 5 students, so I implement that for the students variable. Initialize that at 5. Then I have an array called grades, and the number of elements I'm going to use, that is going to be whatever the value I initialized for the student variable, which is 5. And then the next display for cout is just for aesthetics. So student grades manager, right? Because the program says to make an application to manage student grades. Now is my function call. So I'm going to call the input grade function, and in the call, remember, no type for the parameter, so the array and the size. So grades and student. Why am I calling the input function first? Well, that's the first task, is you're going to ask the user to enter the grades for each student. So that's going to be the first call in main. Then we are going to display all grades. So we're going to call the next function, which we prototype on line 14, right? And you already know that these are going to be loops when we define them. So the function call, which is the function name without the type, and then the parameter, which is the array and the size. I'll pause a little bit. I think some of you are working on this. Most of you are. So once we finish this, we'll take attendance, and then I'll stick around to the end of class. If you need help, I'll help you out. Then the next one, we are going to call the next two function, which is to determine the highest and the lowest, right? But in this one, remember what I said, and we saw that this in the sales calculation, or the sales program, where we would start with some kind of value. What would be the highest and what would be the lowest, right? How are we going to determine we're going to be able to do that? By the comparison. So here you have a variable called highest, and we're going to call the highest, find the highest function, and in that we would pass the array. Then we have a variable called lowest, and we're going to call find lowest function, and we would pass the array. And then lastly, we would calculate and display the average. So we would call, again, we would have a variable called average, and we will call the calculate average function, and we will pass the array as its parameter. Any question? Okay, let's proceed. Then we're gonna display the highest grade. So we're gonna do a C out highest grade. Then the next line is the lowest grade. And after that will be our average grade. It will be the same order on how you call the function. So then we would bring down the variable for the highest, right? The lowest and the average. So if you want the lowest to be displayed first, then call that first, right? In this section, I mean. And then, so it really depends on how you want to look at it. I think, based on what I feel as a user, I probably want to see the highest score first, right? And then the lowest, and then the average. So, but that's really up to you on how the placement for that. Um, so you would call it based on the order that you need and then implement that so it's easier for you to follow through in your code. Remember that this is the main section. We still have to define the function. So as you see, right, as we progress, our programs are a little longer and a little longer. Okay. So after main, we're going to do function definition. We would start with the order, how we prototype. So we would then have avoid input grades. Sorry, let me put that in. And inside this function, right, what we see is the body is going to be the for loop. And we would then pass the array for that function, as you can see. So the grades is going to go in there. And again, this is a definition of a function. So we need to put in the type. Only the function call, you don't put in the type, okay? So when you define the function, you need to make sure that you type the parameter, and if it's a returning function, you type the function, okay? So we would have a for loop. It starts at index 0. It's going to go up to the size and increment after each loop. And we would have a C out for that. Enter grade for student, and we would do index +1. So student 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then we have a CIN to record each input back into the array. And this one, because it's a function, we have an outer curly brace set and an inner curly brace set, right? For the for loop inside, and then the function. So the for loop is the body of the function. And similarly, you would proceed to the next one, which is going to be displaying your grades. So we have a display grades function as we prototype at the top. We have the array that is passed. So array name and its size. And in this one, similar to what you have, all you need is to modify the cout. And we don't have a CIN. So We have a for loop, start with index 0, go up to the size increment after each loop. And we want to display student, index +1, and then the grades that they have. Now, if you're working with multi-dimensional array, again, we have to make sure that we nest another for loop here. This is not the case. So as it records the input, it would display each of the index after the input, right? So in this program, it's basically a pseudo program where it's just gonna first record the input, then it's gonna take the input and display it. Right? In other languages, you can actually simultaneously do that. So it will read each input as it's entered. And you can dedicate processor core to be able to do that. So that way it's better in performance. So the C compiler in this case, it builds the program top down. So you have to have the array that has all the input first, and then it's going to access each of the index in that array to output. It's sequential. Then next, what we'll do is we are going to determine the highest. So we would then use a find highest function. This one is a returning function, so we type it as double. We're gonna pass the array into the function. So here in the parameter, you have your array. Then we build the base, right? Assuming that the highest is the first index, we would loop through the array and we want to check. If the grade is higher than the first element in the array, then that grade is the highest. So it's gonna check each of the index, and it would start with the first element. It's gonna compare against that, and then if it's not, then it's not the highest, right? If it is, then it would be considered the highest. And then the next element check against that, the highest element at that moment. So you're gonna see that it's gonna loop through. So you give it a base, which is the first index value, check against it. If it's higher, then it is considered the highest. And then it's gonna sequentially go through each of the elements that way. Any question? Okay, almost done. We're gonna return the highest, and we repeat the same process for the lowest, right? You use lowest variable, and we would start with the first element, check against that to see if it is lower. So we're gonna use less than operator here. And if it is lower, then it's considered the lowest grade at that moment. So as it loops through, it's gonna check each element against the lowest, which could be the first or the previous. Okay. So you see the technique now for highest and lowest. So I see some student in my other courses, they like to implement logical operator. You can do it for this one, right? In the if statement. So yeah, you can wrap it up and be able to do lowest and highest together. But, you know, that's going to be a lot. So you have to logically think about that. How can I implement it where I don't have to loop twice, right? I can implement a logical operator to be able to do that. Um, so. So we're going to return the lowest, close up that function. Then you have the last one, which is going to be the average calculation. So this function, again, we're going to pass the array into the function, and then we are going to first initialize the total variable at 0. Remember, to do the average, we have to sum it up and then divide it by the size. So as we loop, we're going to add the grades after each loop. And then we are going to return the total, and we're going to divide it by size. And that will be the end of our program. Is the last function definition, which is the average calculation. So you would define it based on the order that you prototype and the order that you call. And then so that way, if you debug it, it's easier, right? And the compiler, it also build your program sequentially based on how you code it, top to the bottom. Okay. So if I need to modify the last function, I would then go to the bottom and be able to edit it, right? Because that will be the last one that's called in main and the last one that was prototype at the top. So the takeaway from this was that we implemented just like how we learned to work with prototyping and the function that we defined, right? We talked about that last week, but today we're using the array as the parameter, right? On how we would pass the array to the function. Simply, just like the variable, it's just a larger container. And you would then include the bracket, which is the square bracket here, right? And the size in the parameter. Any question? Okay, I'm gonna stop the video. I know some of you are working on it. So that way we can proceed to taking attendance in a few minutes.